Wartime kidnapping in the occupied territories and in cities bombed by the Russian army. Russia has elaborated a scheme of kidnapping and put the abduction and deportation of Ukrainian children on stream.
The military deport children from the so-called DPR and LPR to detention camps in Russia.
Children that are deported to adoptive families in Russia often have living parents at home in Ukraine.
If you don't come, we will be adopted or will be sent to the orphanage.
Russians are trying to re-educate Ukrainian children, turning the propaganda machine and psychological pressure at full.
They sang the Ukrainian anthem at first, Glory to Ukraine, but with a bit of time the integration took place.
Who from the highest officials are involved in this scheme organization?
It is impossible to take out so many children if no one is behind it.
Where illegally deported children and teenagers are sent, and why should Russia raise and educate abducted Ukrainian children? More in the special report Wartime Kidnapping in the Occupied Territories. Why does Russia need Ukrainian children? Health improvement in camps and holidays, evacuation from shelling, humanitarian missions and goals. These are the pretexts Russia uses to illegally deport Ukrainian children from temporarily occupied by its troops' territories. First, from the territories of Donbass, seized in 2014, and now, after a full-scale invasion, from almost to the ground destroyed Mariupol. From Kherson and settlements of the region occupied for 8 months, from seized Melitopol. With force and deceit, Russian military have been kidnapping and taking out children and teenagers by order of highest officials. For most of them, this is a one-way ticket.
You say you saw a child being taken out of the city. What did the child look like? Perhaps you know the name and surname of the child.
Kyiv, the Human Rights Ombudsman's office. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, relatives and witnesses to the kidnapping of children by occupiers have been rushing off the hotline phones asking for help. Every day the number of deported children is growing.
Every day I receive data from the state portal Children of 4. Unfortunately, what I see is that the Russian Federation representatives forcibly kidnap, kill and cripple Ukrainian children every day. Daily
contacts with relatives, law enforcement officers, international authorities and working meetings. So far, for almost a year of the war, only 360 of more than 19,000 Ukrainian children whose kidnapping was officially confirmed have been returned home.
This number is small, but believe me, the return of even one child is a many special operation, involving many specialists, including reconnaissance team, which help to take children from the Russian territory.
The Commissioner of the Parliament of Ukraine for Human Rights tells the story of a 16-year-old teenager from occupied Nikolsky near Mariupol. Shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he and his sister became orphans.
Representatives of the Russian occupation authorities took him from destroyed, ruined Mariupol, forcibly brought to the territory of Donetsk, then to the territory of Rostov, and then the Lvova-Belova personally transported him by plane to Moscow. The so-called adoption process was like, look, this is your new family.
Sergei's Ukrainian documents were confiscated, Russian were given out, native language was forbidden.
There wasn't even a possibility to be Ukrainian. Ukrainian children must immediately start studying a Russian school. They fall under the pressure of this general propaganda. There are no other possibilities. Russian parents did not even want Sergei to be with them, because they already had 4 children at that moment. Parents did not even communicate with him. He did not even receive nearly enough food.
Office of the Ukrainian Ombudsman supervised Sergei's return to Ukraine. Officials don't share details in order not to interfere with the future operations.
The teen made the first very important step to return. Then they helped him. And on December 19, 2022, he arrived in Kyiv and saw a lot of cars with Ukrainian number plates, began to smile and said, "Listen, I'm in Ukraine, I'm back." He has already got Ukrainian documents, all legal statuses, including a status of trafficked child. But no one knows how much time his psychological recovery will take.
А скільки треба часу, щоб йому психологічно повернути себе, про це не знає ніхто.
The kidnapping of Serhiy is an example of a scheme of deliberate abduction of Ukrainian children and sending them to Russian adoptive families. The scale of the deportation is huge. According to various data which cannot be confirmed at the moment, Russia could have taken more than 500,000 of children out of Ukraine. The National Information Bureau, which collects allegations of war crimes against children, gives an even more shocking number, over 744,000. Influential Western media and human rights activists have similar data.
It is impossible to deport so many children if no one is behind it.
Who is the organizer of the criminal scheme? The answer has the Mulfar Osent community, which identifies Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The reconnaissance team, according to data, found photos, documents and established where Ukrainian children were sent before the adoption.
They have dots in their report maps. You can see the Gorky camp, Moskva Zvezda camp, 7 camps, they are on the map.
Seems that criminal scheme is supervised by the Russian Children's Ombudsman. Last year, Maria Lvova-Belova officially launched the so-called humanitarian project to help children from the so-called LPR and DPR and the territories of Ukraine seized in 2022 into children's hands. She wants to create a data bank of orphans and children without care and to make them live with Russian families.
They steal children from families on the occupied territories on checkpoints, take away children whose parents died and place them in temporary bases in the so-called DPR, LPR. Exactly the headquarters of Maria Lvova-Belova supervises all issues about children.
Maria Lvova-Belova is a commissioner of the President of Russia for Children's Rights, an official who is obliged not only to know but also to defend the basic rights of children and comply with international law and agreements on their protection and prevention of violations. According to local propaganda, she is an example of a caring mother heroine, the person who should be followed. Lvova-Belova and her husband, a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church, bring up 5 their own, 5 adopted children and take care of 13 more children. Dozens of materials and TV programs have been made about her.
They like when the whole big family gathers together, but it is not often possible. Older children are already adults and live separately. Katya lived in this house for about a year, but that was enough to understand the difference between an orphanage and family relationships.
I want to have such a relationship with my husband because it is very important to devote your life to your husband, to yourself, and later to bring children up in the same way.
In September last year, Lvova-Belova publicly announced the adoption of Philip, a teenager from Mariupol who was allegedly evacuated straight out of the cellars with 30 other children.
You have adopted a child from Mariupol.
Yes, but thanks to you, Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Is he small?
No, he's 15. Now I know what it's like to be a mother of a child from Donbass.
The ombudsman publicly demonstrates her new adopted son to Russians. Moreover, she uses stories about him to advertise the adoption of Ukrainian children.
Children responded negatively about the president of Russia, said all sorts of nasty things, thanked the anthem of Ukraine, glory to Ukraine, and such like. One of the boys is now in my family and I can see the changes now.
Adoption of Ukrainian children is not only promoted in Russia, but also encouraged with money in the amount of almost 600,000 rubles. Moreover, the decree on simplifying the granting of Russian citizenship signed by Vladimir Putin removed all obstacles on the way of fast adoption. Lvova-Belova, in order to stir up the interest of compatriots in Ukrainian children, puts pressure on pity and frankly lies about their stories.
There were several cases when foster parents left their children with their documents at the time of their special operation. They evacuated themselves but left the children. The kids said that they woke up and had nothing, no food, water, documents, parents, and then they sought for shelters, organized themselves in small groups in cellars to survive.
The Mulfar team has established accomplices of the Russian Children's Ombudsman. There are representatives of the so-called LPR and DPR and the occupation administrations, including government officials of the Russian Federation at different levels. In the photo from the Kremlin's website, we can see another plane with children from occupied Donbas brought by Lvova Belova, and one of her most zealous accomplices is the governor of the Moscow region. He helps to place Ukrainian children into adoptive families.
Andrei Vorobyov, together with Maria Lvova-Belova, gave Russian documents for children taken out from the occupied territories.
The deportation of Ukrainian children from the occupied territories has been literally put on the stream. Representatives of the so-called authorities and social structures of the occupation administrations are involved in the selection of candidates for export to the Russian Federation. In order to take children away from their families, they use deceit, threats and so-called courts. According to Ukrainian human rights activists, for over 7 months of last year, 38,000 sentences were passed in the so-called LDPR to deprive parental rights.
Each commission is accompanied by a representative of the People's Militia, in other words, occupier with a gun. It gives legitimacy, in quotation marks, to the words of this commission. When parents in the occupied territories did not want to send children to schools to study according to Russian programs in Starobelsk, Melitopol, Kherson, when Kherson was still occupied, the occupation administrations told parents that they would deprive them of parental rights if children didn't start attending schools.
Children from their families are lured out under the pretext of rest and health improvement. It is conducted by the headquarters of the organization into children's hands, which was opened on the occupied territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions and also Melitopol, Zaporizhia region.
Russians offered trips to our children to visit the territory of Krasnodar and Crimea. We know examples when more than 300 children were taken away from Enerhodar and other towns under the pretext of vacations. They were supposed to return in 2 weeks, but 1 month later Russians asked children's parents to hand over winter clothes. And only when parents began to call for help in the press and on a public level, the children were returned.
3 children of Mariupol citizen Yevhen Mezhevy were also planned to be given to adoptive parents. The family was separated when they were forcibly evacuated from the town.
We were in a bomb shelter on the territory of the hospital when the military came in and said that we had 10 minutes to evacuate. They were from the DPR. They said that in the previous bunkers, the doors were blocked and people couldn't get out.
The Russian military did not let the children's father come out from the filtration camp. They sent him to a colony in Elenivka. 13-year-old Matvey and his sisters were taken to a sanatorium near Moscow. Employees knew that they had a father. Having left Elenivka, Yevhen immediately got in touch with the children.
I decided to go to Novoazovsk social service because Mariupol belonged to this district. I wrote a statement that upon the children's arrival from the camp, I would take them back. I asked for any nurturer's phone number and a video meeting with my children.
Soon the Russian social workers came to the sanatorium to visit the children and brought some news and offers for them.
They began to tell us that the camp would end in 5 days, and because of shelling in Donetsk, they couldn't send us home. We needed to stay somewhere, either in an orphanage or a foster family. They began to prove that it would be better to stay in a foster family. I said that without my dad's decision, I wouldn't go anywhere. I told them that I needed to ask him first.
The father's instant reaction saved the children from being adopted by a Russian family.
I managed to get there in 2 days. Parents like me simply don't have time to come and take their children back. The volunteers that helped me wrote a letter to the President's Office for Children's Affairs, demanding that the children should have stayed with me, their legal representative.
Having reunited with the children, Yevhen realized that they had been prepared for adoption from the first days of their stay in the sanatorium. Children were treated psychologically and their health was also examined.
During the 24 days of their stay in sanatorium, they had undergone so many tests that I would probably not be able to pass in 6 months. 4 sheets of analyses.
Sick Ukrainian children aren't interesting for potential Russian parents. The leadership of the Russian Federation initiated a mass medical examination in the occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The Russian government allocated 350 million rubles for this. 80,000 children are supposed to be examined.
The Russians return deported children with illness in order not to have such an array of returns. Mishustin has signed an order on thorough medical examination of potentially possible to be deported kids. Healthy children are sent away to Russia. Sick kids are left in Ukraine.
Children were mass kidnapped from the occupied settlements of Kherson region. Under the auspices of representatives of the occupation, all the infants from the Kherson baby house were taken out to an unknown destination. Lvova Belova personally came to Henichesk for the abandoned babies. She stated that she would take them under personal control for the further socialization in society. Disabled children were taken from the orphanage in the occupied Oleshki to the annexed Crimea. The Russian military and Federal Security Service officers tried to take away children from a rehabilitation center in Stepanivka, but employees and local villagers hid them.
When the Russians first came to us, we had only 5 children. With that amount of kids, they couldn't do video for propaganda, and that is the main thing for them.
Картинку, что вот тут вот так вот они помогают, и не получилось. Вот есть самые
Here are the oldest ones, Varvara and Danilo. And just like that, 52 children. I heard on Russian propaganda TV channels that they take orphans, send them to the Suvorov military school, re-educate and make them fight for Russia against Ukraine.
Kidnapped Ukrainian orphans and children deprived of guardianship, as well as children with disabilities, become a tool of manipulation. With their help, Russia creates an image of the state that saves the lives of the disadvantaged for the international community, and inside the country to root in the minds of Russians the myth of the Nazis in Ukraine, and to support the war, instilling love for Russia and hatred for Ukraine. These are the real but hidden aims of large-scale deportation. After all, the militarization of the younger generation in the Russian Federation begins almost from the cradle.
War is love. War is the friend. War is the future for the world. We young, valiant special forces, we always are ready to serve you.
Methods that have been successfully tested on Russians will also be used to Russify deported Ukrainian children in adopted Russian families.
A group of younger children, those 4 or 5-year-olds who won't remember anything about Russia, who will be told, like Russian teenagers are today, and like Russian children are today, that the way to make Russia whole again, the way to make Russia secure, and the way to defend this sort of mythical idea of, and the government is doing that, as everybody probably knows, with new school programs, with new youth groups, military youth groups in particular, by creating new state-produced movies that are big budget films, really pushing this message down the throats of Russian children.
Replenishment of losses in a full-scale war against Ukraine is another goal of Russian kidnapping, reports the OSCE.
Children born in 2005-2006 are already subject to mandatory military registration in Russia. Such a plan to use Ukrainian children as cannon fodder in the Russian war is, I don't have the words, pure evil. Michael Carpenter, US Ambassador to the OSCE.
In addition, the occupying state wants to populate the depressive Russian provinces with young people with Slavic appearance. According to Molfar agency, children are being deported to 57 regions, including Sakhalin, Astrakhan, Murmansk and Dagestan.
They are angry by the fact that today the Russian Federation is a country of ethnic groups and migrants from Central Asia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities, metropolitan cities, don't have problems with the population. But in the outback, where there are factories, where you have to work, where you get derisory wages, where there is no infrastructure, they need this population so that it can multiply.
Russia forcibly detains even those children and adolescents who have expressed their desire to return to Ukraine. Negotiations about this between the ombudsmen of the two countries did not bring results. The Ukrainian side's request to provide a list with children's names was rejected.
Такий сухий підхід. Вам треба, будь
There is such an approach. If you need information, get an official request. Date of birth, who is looking for a child, context. Come to us. We will do it in accordance with the Russian law. We will establish some sort of adoption procedure. Believe me, this is definitely not what is written in the norms of international humanitarian law.
згідно міжнародного гуманітарного права. Те, що Росія
What the Russian Federation has done and continues to do in relation to Ukrainian children must be legally recognized as genocide. The forced transfer of children from one ethnic group to another is considered to be a genocide.
визнається як геноцид.
Массовая насильственная депортация, усыновление.
The forced deportation of children, adoption and custody transfer during the continuation of hostilities and forced change of citizenship. All these actions of Russia against Ukrainian children are qualified by the world community and international organizations as egregious and illegal. Russia violates not only the laws of Ukraine, but also a number of international conventions and agreements adopted specifically to prevent such crimes and illegal actions. Russia bluntly ignores the rules and customs of war, commits crimes against the rights and liberties of the individual, as well as against the children's rights for life, security, immunity and protection from torture and violence. Russia's actions are already demonstrating signs of deliberate genocide and crimes against humanity. When they took me away from my mother, they didn't even let me say goodbye. And then I asked where they were taking me. They said to the orphanage, and that the other family will adopt me there. This is the story of 12-year-old Sasha from Mariupol. When he was trying to leave the town, he was separated from his mother in the filtration camp. Ukraine managed to return the boy to his homeland. After returning, Sasha's voice was heard in Davos at the World Economic Forum. Ukraine voices the topic of forced deportation on all possible platforms and at the highest level in the highest offices.
To bring back all the deported children, we really need the power of the whole world. I believe that we can provide it.
The topic of deportation is in a global agenda. The US Congress ordered the US administration to collect evidence of crimes against humanity and Russian war crimes in Ukraine. An investigation of the actions of the Russian Federation against Ukrainian children has already begun at the UN and the OSCE.
The OSCE institutions can play a key role in this matter. After all, crimes against children, when our future is stolen from us, Ukrainians, is a crime against all of us, regardless of our nationality. This is unacceptable.
European and American politicians publicly call the kidnapping of Ukrainian children a war crime, and they support the formation of a special tribunal. The responsibility of those involved have already been warned from The Hague.
Reports of thousands of Ukrainian children illegally kidnapped by Russia from the occupied territories and given in for adopting are unacceptable. We will work on investigating war crimes.
Those children are separated from their families and forced to grow up in a foreign country, far from home and often brainwashed. And this deliberate Russian policy, as soon as possible. They are Ukrainian and they will remain Ukrainian. And Russia must put to an end this criminal practice immediately.
For involvement in the mass abduction and removal of Ukrainian children and violation of their rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian children's ombudsman, was sanctioned by the United States of America, UK, Canada and Australia. She is included in the sanctions list of the European Union as a curator of the policy of deportation and adoption of Ukrainian children in the Russian Federation. In Ukraine, an investigation has been initiated against Lvova-Belova. The Parliament of Ukraine is developing bills on holding accountable for the forced transfer of Ukrainian children into Russia. Ukraine thoroughly documents all statements and evidence of the deportation of children to Russia. Human rights activists filed a notification with the International Criminal Court about Russia's actions as a crime that contains elements of genocide. Illegal and forced deportation will become a separate case of a special international tribunal for Russian war crimes. Olga Mikhaluk, Special Report.